Welcome to this afternoon's Educate and Act event. This is actually the 17th event in this series. My name is Emily Ryan and I direct the Commons, which is one of the three partners bringing you these events in order to help illuminate our understanding of public policy and process as it impacts us as US citizens and residents. Our partners in that series, of course, are the KU Center for Service Learning and the Emily Taylor Center for Women and Gender Equity. Please be present in this space today for the event as makes sense for you, with respect to you and also for others who are here, keeping in mind that as an act of the federal government, NAGPRA reflects a set of policies and processes born out of a system which forced itself on peoples in this place whose own lives, ancestors, and lands long preceded the system, and whose descendants we are fortunate to know as colleagues, teachers, friends, and neighbors today. That is to say, we are here today for a conversation and an effort to learn and to better understand federal policy. We also are not able to answer specific questions about KU's repatriation process or the work that's ongoing. If you have questions about that, the best resource is to go to repatriation.ku.edu, which has, I think, been recently updated with some new information. As far as logistics, I just will ask that all of our audience members keep their microphones muted today during the event. We will try to have time for questions at the end, but there's like a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to be able to do that. And so at this point, I'm glad to be able to hand it over to my colleague at the Commons, Meg Smith, who will get our conversation started today.
Thank you, Emily. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meg Smith. I am the graduate assistant for the Commons this year and a student in the Museum Studies program at KU. Educate and Act is a series that was created in the spring of 2020 in an effort to create opportunities for students to access information and resources about civic engagement as it relates to democracy in the US. Seeing that individuals have varying ways of applying their interest and skills, and that legislative issues tend to be complex, this series prioritizes learning about the policies and processes that govern us and connect students to resources and opportunities to be involved. The goal of this event is to promote understanding of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. There are several NAGPRA specialists at KU who can speak to this topic, as well as discuss the recent updates to this law under Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. We present this discussion alongside an acknowledgement that this nation has a long, violent history of colonization, a history we are still living in, which has impacted Native American people in particular, both in the past and present. Our panelists today include Carlton Shield Chief Gover, Assistant Curator of Archaeology, KU Biodiversity Institute and Natural History Museum, Assistant Professor, Anthropology. Dennis O'Rourke, Foundation Distinguished Professor, Anthropology, and Tom Torma, Repatriation Program Manager. Thank you so much for being here today. For our first question, what is your relationship to NAGPRA and how does it impact the work that you do?
Anybody, do you have a preference for who goes first? I can go first, I don't mind.
Oh yes, no preference in order.
Okay, sure. I came to NAGPRA when I moved to California. I had previously taught, my background is, my PhD is in early medieval Irish literature of all things, which is, if I dare say, not the typical path that people take to get involved in with NAGPRA. But I ended up taking a job teaching at a tribal college in on the Crow Reservation at Little Bighorn College. When I moved to California, I got my soon-to-be ex-wife's family lives in Northern California. So when we moved there, because of my background, I had done some activism work. So I had worked on compliance, especially NEPA compliance, more from the environmental side. I had a familiarity with archaeology, even though I wasn't an archaeologist. Had a familiarity with history, and I had a history of working with tribes. I ended up becoming the THPO, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Wiyot tribe. And THPOs are specifically responsible for handling what we call 106 consultations, which requires consultation with tribes when there's a federal nexus in the law. I don't want to get too much into that, but as part of my responsibilities, as is the case for many THPOs, I had numerous additional tasks, and one of them was dealing with NAGPRA. And so while I was there, I represented the tribe to multiple museums, the Field Museum, the Smithsonian, the Autry Museum, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and a few others, with a high degree of success. And we got back pretty much everything we asked for, with one or two minor exceptions, and with the exception of UC Berkeley. I ended up having this kind of high-profile fight that went before the National Review Committee, which actually Dennis was on. That's how I came to know Dennis at the time, and we got a sort of mixed result. But I think it's safe to say that the tribe was a little bit disappointed ultimately in the outcome. But it did sort of, a lot of people heard about it, and so when Berkeley was advertising for their position, I applied for and got the position there, and I ran the program there for about 2 years, managed to repatriate several hundred ancestors. I forget the exact number off the top of my head. I put up multiple notices and moved the program ahead quite a bit. And then for various personal and professional reasons, ended up deciding, and frankly, what it really came down to is I didn't really love the Bay Area. It was a little bit crowded for me, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my life there. So I started looking for programs that I felt like I could really kind of feel comfortable in. Berkeley was making the changes, but it was slow. And they're doing a great job now. But they ended up applying for and getting the position here at KU. And so that's what landed me here today.
I go next, if that's all right. Hi, Tom. My path to NAGPRA and involvement with NAGPRA is a little more traditional than Tom's, I guess. I'm an anthropological geneticist, and much of my career has been focused on using genetic and now genomic data to understand population histories and patterns of movement in time and space. And I focus mostly in the North American Arctic region. And but very early in my career, I also worked in the Great Basin. And as technology developed and changed in genetics, it became possible to access the ancient DNA. And we began to use those methods. And as a result, because we were interested in looking at ancestral populations of contemporary groups, it led me to extensive consultations and discussions and collaborations with tribes and communities, villages in Alaska over the period of the last 25 years or so. And because of that experience and my interest in consultation and trying to understand the questions I was interested in from the descendant perspective, I ended up serving several years, 6, I think, on the state NAGPRA committee in the state where I lived at that time in Utah. And then subsequently, following that several years of state NAGPRA work, I was appointed to the National NAGPRA Committee, where I served for a 4-year term. And I found it one of the most rewarding and also sometimes one of the most frustrating exercises, because many of the cases heard at National NAGPRA were the difficult ones, where agreements could not have been worked out or couldn't get worked out beforehand. And so trying to adjudicate various types of claims was sometimes very satisfying, sometimes frustrating. And so I assume that's why I'm here today, is I have had some considerable background working with NAGPRA at various levels.
Cool. So I guess that just leaves me. So I have I wouldn't say born into NAGPRA, but very close. Being a tribal citizen, but not only that, but having a family who's had objects taken from them by museums, and having that very close, like at an early age realization. Like first time I visited the Field Museum, I was in 4th grade, and I remember my father talking to the front secretary of the museum, and we like kind of waited there. My mom was getting impatient, but it ended up the director of the museum coming down and like talking to my father, and he just got whisked away on our family vacation. And we ended up getting like our own private tour guide, which was strange. And it wasn't until later what I'd found out was that the Chicago Field Museum stole my great grandfather's medicine bundle, which was robbed from his casket before he was buried. And we didn't know about it until the passage of NAGPRA in 1990. And so from like a very early age, I was like kind of clued into this history, and living at the time near DC with family who worked at various levels of the interior of the Smithsonian, kind of knowing about this history, this personal connection to NAGPRA, but also the tribal history to NAGPRA. And so I've always been around it, and, getting my degrees in anthropology, as well as supplementing those with museums studies, professional certificates, as well as, Native American Indigenous Studies certificates. I've grounded all of my work in collaborative approaches with Indigenous populations into archaeological research, museum studies, and cultural care practices as they relate to curation and collections management in museum. And so like, even though I'm like new to KU, this is my, I think, 9th week being employed. I've been working in this area closely with tribes from Kansas and Nebraska for about a decade throughout my entire career. So I'm very familiar with the cultural landscape of this area and the major tribal communities who I have close relationships with and ongoing projects. So I imagine that's why, I'm here.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you for telling us a little bit more about your relationship to NAGPRA. Our next question is about, what is the history of NAGPRA, particularly how did it become a federal policy?
I'm not an expert on the history of NAGPRA. I know it was a long process of discussion at the federal level and in areas of academics related to archaeology or indigenous studies. I don't know the full history of its development, other than that it was a fairly long one. It was very contentious, NAGPRA was, when the first version was passed in the early 1990s. A lot of the fears, of course, that were generated during that time certainly did not come to pass, and it has become an established and I think well respected and valued tool for restoring ancestors and sacred objects and articles of cultural patrimony and such things to their original and honest owners.
Yeah, I'm certainly not a legal historian or anything like that. And I think it's safe to say, digging in Native American graves is something that goes back to quite literally Jamestown and Plymouth and in the earliest moments of this nation's history. That said, and it's, in the 60s and 70s, tribes had always legally had sovereignty, but they did not. Sorry, I've got an overly friendly cat. But they did not. In the 60s and 70s, they really started to advocate for it and give it meaning. My understanding of the law is that the fight for NAGPRA, if you will, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong on this, began with a woman called Maria Pearson, in 1976. Her husband worked for, I believe it was the Iowa Department of Transportation, and informed her that they had uncovered graves, Native American graves. And the white people got reinterred, and I believe it was a Native American woman and her child were sent off to a university for research. And so that sort of was the thing that started the specific fight for NAGPRA in 1976. She lobbied and managed to get passed a bill in Iowa for graves protection that basically required them to be reburied and establish some state burial grounds. She then, she was a bit of an organizer. She started networking with other tribes. Again, this is where I'm not, which tribes played what role and who exactly was involved. But that ultimately led to some court decisions, both good and bad, that resulted in 1989 the passage of the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which is very, very similar to NAGPRA, but applies only to the Smithsonian. And then in 1990, NAGPRA was passed. And NAGPRA basically sort of has two parts. One is the graves protection, which is, as I understand it, and again, there's probably people here who know this better than I do, but protects our ancestors that are currently in the ground. And then we have the repatriation, which is the parts of the law that go back to the that require repatriation from museums. The museums have a special definition. I can talk about that if you want. But ultimately, we don't deal too much with the graves protection. That's mostly applies to federal lands. We pretty much are dealing with the repatriation portions of that provision. Ultimately, though, I think where we're at now, and I might be getting ahead of myself, and I apologize, is there was a kind of a bit of a lack of compliance from institutions across the country, and things weren't moving, and so the National NAGPRA sort of took the lead, grabbed the bull by the horns, and passed these new regulations, which I think is designed to expedite and improve the repatriation process. And those passed, I think those went into effect. I know it passed in December, and I think they went into effect in January.
Yeah, and to expand on what Tom's saying with the history, like, you don't get NAGPRA or the Smithsonian Act without the recognition that American Indians have a religion and rights, which were outlawed in this country in the 19th century. And it wasn't until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of like 1978 does the country even acknowledge that American Indians and indigenous people can practice their religion freely. Up until that time, it was illegal to do so. So that it really builds this case for then, one of the tenets of NAGPRA is not only graves, but funerary objects and ceremonial objects of cultural patrimony. And without the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, recognizing that those exist and can have those practices, the objects that come with the graves as well, and that cultural patrimony, such as like, my family's medicine bundle, they can be repatriated. And there was several different threads throughout the 70s and 80s. Like right before the Smithsonian Act, you have the Nebraska Human Unmarked Burial Act of 1989, which was the first state version of NAGPRA. And that was with a fight between the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and the state of Nebraska, in which the Pawnees won and were able to get these things buried. And now, as of, I think 2 or 3 years ago, Wyoming was the last state to adopt a state version of NAGPRA. And so now not only do we have a national law, but every state has its own version of NAGPRA that's specific to state lands, because NAGPRA only applies to federal agencies, federal property, and institutions that receive federal money. So we kind of have multiple different angles from these different laws at various levels of government that aid in the repatriation of these objects back to their communities.
Thank you. So this next question, it's kind of regarding the role of NAGPRA in particular. Is it seen as a best practice, and how do the parties involved in the process kind of like view it?
From my
Go ahead, Dennis.
perspective as a researcher, I view NAGPRA as a minimal best practices statement. I think there's more that researchers can and should do with respect to consultation and continuing communication with tribal groups or village leaders, whatever the case may be. NAGPRA is an important foundation for that, I think. And one of the things in my career, at least I think I have seen, is because of NAGPRA, the change in best practices among academic researchers has improved dramatically and really increased the awareness and engagement with consultation and continuing consultation and dialogue with groups and being much better listeners.
Oh, did you want to say, or should I go?
I can go real quick. Yeah, I think it's, it's been best practice, for the past 3 decades to not only abide by NAGPRA to fulfill our legal obligations, but also to do better. And when you look at across the country, who are generally the bad actors, those that are trying to subvert or go around the law, they're generally of an older generation getting their PhDs prior to 1990. They were upset to begin with. And we've seen like within the past decade, an explosion of new NAGPRA cases and repatriations as that generation retires and new professionals come in realizing they have literal skeletons in the closet that have been hidden. So there's kind of been this lag in the past 2 decades that we're really seeing now of this new generation that is doing NAGPRA under good faith, committed to working with indigenous nations. And we've seen this in the museum studies field and archaeology in general, how different societies and professional organizations have created their own doctrine and their own rules to go above and beyond NAGPRA to create these meaningful relationships with descendant communities in that time. So we're just kind of seeing this lag effect of folks leaving and the newer generations coming in that are trying to right the wrongs of the past.
And if I can just talk a little bit, just to clarify something Dennis said, NAGPRA is a law, and there are enforcement mechanisms and penalties if we don't adhere to it. But Dennis is absolutely right that we want to go. NAGPRA is a minimal compliance, and there's lots of space and lots of things we can do to go above and beyond on that minimal compliance. Without getting into the finer points of what exactly, like at this point, what's the best practice? Broadly speaking, I'm housed in the Office of Audit, Risk, and Compliance. So I am very much concerned with the compliance. And then, after that, I try not to impose too much in the way of best practices. I feel like the best practice I can do is figure out ways to get to yes, to borrow the head of national NAGPRA programs. That's something she's always advising us to do. So figure out ways of getting to yes. That means listening to tribes, outlining the processes they want to go through it, working with them to make sure that we understand their culturally appropriate definitions beyond just the legal definitions, being proactive, and ultimately trying to develop a NAGPRA program where tribes are in the driver's seat, making key important decisions and working with us to make sure that what should get home does get home.
Yes, so we know that there were recent updates to the law. Could you all please talk about kind of how the law has changed and how those changes or those recent updates affect your work?
Someone who is more current on the updates than me probably should take that one, Tom
Sure.
or Carlton.
I am getting up. I'm just gonna share a screen. That's okay. Okay, is everybody seeing there where it says that these are the key points? So the Native American Graves Protection Act were revised on January 12th. The key provision, probably the one that's impacting us the most, is the duty of care. in particular, we have to consult with Native nations and obtain their consent before researching, not just researching, but also, providing any sort of access, teaching, public display or anything like that. Both museums, here at KU, I think turned it around very quickly. There weren't really many items up that caused concern. And so it's anything that might be considered to be NAGPRA eligible. So that would be anything from the 50 states that may be of Native American origins in terms of archaeological material. And then we have items that were collected ethnographically. That might meet the NAGPRA definitions of sacred object. It's basically items necessary for ceremony or an object of cultural patrimony, which are items that are key to a culture's identity, or for that matter, a subset of a culture as well could meet that definition. Other things that I think we've really taken to heart would include, the role of consultation, I think, has been increasingly highlighted, and the ability of tribes to engage, in particular using traditional knowledge. Having been a TIPO, I am well aware that tribes often have a lot of knowledge that they don't want to share with institutions. I think in the early days of NAGPRA, there were a lot of cases where tribes would go in and share information during a consultation, and that would turn up in peer-reviewed articles. Researchers were using that. We're not doing any of that kind of stuff, and I think that's really something that's probably not happening. As Carlton pointed to, there's a younger generation that's not doing that anymore. But we still kind of, as part of trying to empower tribes, we don't really, we ask what the concerns are, but we don't ask them. They don't need to share the details of their ceremonies. They don't need to share the details of their cultural patrimony. Most people generally don't want to do that, and to return items that really don't belong to us, making them do that is a little bit out of date, and I think the new regulations reflect that. We also just need to basically be, we're updating our inventories and summaries. Hopefully that will be done in a reasonable length of time. And then, the requirement to make sure that tribes get all the information that we have, that they know about all of the items that we have, and are able to consult meaningfully based on the full body of knowledge held by the institution. So I'll stop sharing at that point. So that's what I see as the key provisions. I suspect other people might see other points of that differently, but that's my drive-by summary.
Yeah, and just to expand on what Todd said, Tom, sorry, about cultural items. There's a provision in there that basically resets consultation, where we're now required to go to each individual nation and ask them what is a cultural item, whereas before it was predetermined. So now these new regulations are very innovative in that the tribes get to tell us and we get to abide. And we've had a nation recently expressed, like, we'll tell you on a site by site basis, assemblage by assemblage basis, which is great. Like that's no issue. We've had to, under the new regulations, right? We saw a bunch of museums in the news, possibly. The one in New York, Chicago Field, and others who had to take down their exhibits in order to abide by these, because they hadn't done that consultation yet. So we here at KU in the Archaeology Division, we took everything down within that like 2-day period, and we didn't have much stuff to begin with. So we don't have the exhibit space that the Chicago Field does. So it's not like we're trying to pat ourselves on the back, like we're in the basement of Spooner, like no one sees it anyways, but we still got it down there. And with ongoing research, the Archaeology Division at the BI supports the Anthropology department as well as museum studies. And so we had to develop research requests, with consultation with Tom and his office to make sure that we were hitting the key points that needed to be made and getting the key provisions, sending out mass emails to the tribes and making sure that research can continue. And we had responses very quickly from tribes that allowed this. So we were still able to continue the dissertation research by several students, as well as support ongoing classes. And it didn't really, for my personal research, it didn't affect what I do, because I do this collaborative work anyways. So this was just, formalizing the process and making sure that we kept a record of the research requests. So we have a number of those hopefully coming soon. So it's just reinforcing the relationships between KU and ancestral populations to Kansas and the surrounding areas.
Yeah,
And if I could just
oh,
go ahead then. Okay, I'll just make a point very quickly. When I worked for the Wiyot tribe in California, California has a lot of these provisions and requiring consultation and stuff forms a larger part of the legal framework that that institutions and agencies have to work within. So we would get a lot of requests, for consultation, government to government consultation from various state, local entities, permitting bodies, and things like that. I think it's important to note for those of you who are on this call that I don't see anything in the regulations that say we can't do research, that we can't display things. It says that we need to do it in consultation with tribes. When I worked in California, a lot of researchers were not happy about having to get permission to do something that they saw as having nothing to do with tribes. But in a very high percentage of the instances, even when they walked in pretty unhappy about it, a large number of researchers walked away. None of them were upset at the end of the process, and a very large percentage of them walked away feeling that it actually improved the quality of their research. And when we worked with tribes, they felt like it, or beg your pardon, when we worked with museums about display and stuff, they felt like it improved the quality of what they were teaching the public. So I think it is really important just for anybody who's concerned about that to realize that tribes have a lot of interest in having things researched, and they're great partners when you do. So Dennis.
What I was going to say was to draw on two threads that Tom and Carlton brought up. We started the discussion about whether NAGPRA is sort of the standard of how things ought to be done, best practices. And what I see with the revision to NAGPRA, especially the duty of care provisions that have been revised, is that they're enhancing the best practices that have been changing in that direction, in at least the areas of research that I'm most familiar with. And they've reinforced that now there is a legal basis for everyone to continue moving in this direction of what I think of as enhanced consultation and discussion, and paying much more attention to listening rather than talking. And what that really leads to, at least in my field and the way I practice it, is to real collaborations in research between communities or tribes and me or researchers like me. And that's remarkably valuable in my view. And I think the revisions to NAGPRA, the current revisions enhance that. And so I find it useful.
Thank you. You all mentioned consultations. What are the steps in the consultation process?
I think I should take
I think that's a Tom answer. I think that's him.
And so I'm gonna share screen again here. Okay, so they so before I say anything about this, I'm just going to quickly say that every consultation is different. And I try to go into every consultation I engage with the understanding that I know nothing. I don't understand their culture. I don't understand their concerns. I don't understand what, I don't know what they're going to claim or not going to claim. I can sometimes feel my way around based on previous discussions, how that works. This is not, like we complete step one and then do a check mark and move on to step two. This is these are sort of key steps, but very often we'll go back and forth. We'll discover new information, so we'll go back to one. But that's the first step, is basically sharing relevant information. That is sharing our inventories, which are the ancestral remains and funerary objects, associated funerary objects, or in the case of ethnographic materials and unassociated, which means that we don't know if there's an individual there with unassociated funerary objects, we share out a summary, provide that information to tribes. And then either party can request consultation, but we're trying to be proactive and get out there. At this point, I think every museum with the new regs is out there requesting consultation. A number of tribes have asked us, like, hey, can you hold off? We're really busy right now, and we're pretty happy to do that. We've got plenty of work to do, and I'm more interested in having good consultation than rapid consultation. So when tribes ask for it, you know, when they're ready, we'll come back around and do that. Obviously, part of that request in the consultation is making sure it goes to the appropriate tribal representatives. We'll usually, sometimes tribes don't like this, but we'll usually ask for something that makes it clear that they're the authorized tribal representatives. Especially coming from California, where there's a lot of people who think that they have some kind of claim to Native American materials. And they might try to put in claims on behalf of tribes and stuff like that against the tribe's wishes. So we usually ask for something on paper that makes it clear. We consult, we sit down, we work with them. And that's really kind of, I mean, at every level here. I didn't put that up there partially because it sort of informs every step of the way. But we meet with them, we talk with them, and then ultimately the job that I'm faced with is, you know, I have to take the available information that I have, provided to me by the tribe, provided to me by the museum, make a determination. That said, usually the determination is made by the tribes. Tribes, I've been very pleased to find out that the tribes have worked really well. They know who's doing what and sort of who can make what claims. They all have working relationships. That definitely makes my job a lot easier. Review the process, go over everything, make sure we have everything down, and then obviously we submit the Federal Register notice to the National NAGPRA, and they'll review it. I make a lot of typos, so they always get back to me with something, and then ultimately that will go up. At that point, we have any party that wants to contest it has 30 days to contest the claim. And then, you know, once that 30-day period is passed, they can still contest it until such time as we transfer control. But once we transfer control, that is then the lack of a better word, I don't like saying ownership, but effectively it's theirs. And then we work on getting it back, and that's transfer of possession. So we have transfer of control, which is legal ownership, for lack of a better word, and then transfer of possession, where it actually comes back into their hands. That said, sometimes, and I've worked on this from both the tribal side and the museum side, repatriation is not always the desired outcome. Sometimes there are items that they don't want back, but they want to be cared for in a separate way. You know, or items that, you know, there's all, you know, sometimes they want to take control, but they don't necessarily want to bring it back into their community because for whatever reason that's inappropriate. So we work with them to ultimately get it to a place where they're comfortable. The most common outcome, I think, by far is getting it back into the community, but it's not the only possible outcome that we have. So, but again, it's very amorphous, and it will change, and we'll move back and forth and go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom, for just kind of walking us through what the process looks like. This question is for all of you. For people who want to better understand NAGPRA, what are some, you know, larger topics that they need to be familiar with in order to kind of understand the complexity and also the importance of the law?
I think the ancient one, or known in most Western literature as the Kennewick Man controversy. You want to wrap your head in like early NAGPRA shenanigans. That's a good one. You know, like shortly after that, you know, the Smithsonian Act, the one that Tom mentioned earlier, you know, they had to amend that repatriation line to also include unaffiliated, and this whole concept of ancestry and what's a descendant came up. So like that's a pretty pivotal one just to understand early NAGPRA. But also like the Native American Rights Fund, NARF, they did a lot. They were contracted early on with at the onset of the passage of NAGPRA to have archaeologists and tribal representatives and tribal attorneys work together to start going through cases. Like that's how my family found out about our bundle being at the Chicago field, was through NARF. Google helps. I mean, there's National NAGPRA that you can go to, but I mean those are just some easy ones right off the bat. But
And I'm actually going to refer back to something Carlton said, which is understanding sovereignty. Carlton, you mentioned that earlier, and I'm just going to reiterate that. NAGPRA can be read in a lot of different ways. It can be, but I always try to see it as an exercise in tribal sovereignty. This is their cultural heritage. It's their culture. It's their belongings. And how do we, as what is technically a museum under NAGPRA, how do we in this entire process from the beginning respect our sovereign rights? So the sovereignty is not just in returning the items, but in doing it in a respectful and meaningful way.
I might just mention that because I'm not affiliated with a museum, in the research I do, to the degree that I occasionally use materials in museums, I rarely contact the museum first and ask about that. I often know where those materials came from and who likely are owners of that material, even if it's still in a museum. And so I try to start consultations with tribal groups and village corporations or tribal leaders of some sort. I might make the museum aware that I'm interested in the material, but I'm going to start working with the groups initially. And if the work goes forward, if the questions of interest are amenable to the groups, they're the ones that request the museum to either make access or repatriate and make access or not. And the reason I chuckled when you asked about process, what is consultation, is that you'll get as many different answers as there are people who work in this field at different levels. And not all consultations will be the same. They will take different trajectories, and just identifying who the appropriate people to consult with is difficult but extremely important, just as it is with in biomedical research on living populations.
Joining you back here to just encourage folks, if they do have a question, that they can submit using the Q&A button. Just keeping in mind that the question would need to be about NAGPRA policy procedure at a federal or state level rather than a situational case. Also, I think a couple of links might be shared as far as that last question goes, as far as resources and events and programs and offices and people here locally that are working to try to create better understanding of the idea of sovereignty, for instance, or understanding of the process by which objects find their way into a museum collection. And so I think Selka might share for the Spencer Museum of Art an event they have coming up, and I'll share one that the Commons is co-hosting with Native American Affairs and Lori Hasselman to be able to bring Caitlin Reed in April to talk about her work. But otherwise, if there are no other questions.
Yes, so thank you to our panelists for being here today and sharing their knowledge and experience with us. If you would like to learn more about repatriation at KU, please visit repatriation.ku.edu. The next event in the Educate and Act series will be on April 2nd at 12 p.m. Climate Feminism and Inclusive Ways of Leading Around Climate Change. So thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you for having us.